Hello everyone, I'm Grandmaster Josh Friedel, and today I'd like to talk to you about practical rook endgame technique. What I mean by this is how to go about winning a rook endgame where, say, you're up a pawn or have a promising position, how to reel in the point in a very nice way. And in a lot of ways, I'm going to discuss techniques on how to be able to do this even if, say, you don't have a lot of time. Like a lot of the times you get to an endgame, you don't have tons of time left. So being able to do this under pressure without a lot of time, I'm going to give practical examples. This one actually happens to be a blitz game of a friend of mine, and they were black here. And like how would you go about winning this position? So if you want to pause your video and try to figure out what you would play here as black, there's no forced win or anything, but just how would you go about winning this? So now that you are, if you've decided to do it yourself, that's cool. But the main techniques that I like to use, and again, these are guidelines. Every endgame and every chess position is different, and sometimes you'll need to do different things. But I like to have guidelines because they will point you in the right direction. Even if you have to still calculate quite a bit, often you do, they will point you in the right direction. And especially if you're low on time and don't have time to calculate every single thing, they will help guide you towards victory and towards the right way. So the first two things seem rather obvious, but I find people underestimate them all the time. The first two things are to improve your rook, maximize your rook, and maximize your king. Sounds obvious, right? They're your only two pieces, but because they're your only two pieces, the king and the rook, you need them to be performing at their best because you don't have any other help, right? That's all you've got. Your opponent, that's all they have too. But if you have a terrible rook and terrible king, you're gonna have a hard time winning, or drawing, or whatever you need to do in the endgame, regardless of whether it's winning or not. And when I see a lot of amateur players, say like under 2,000 or even higher than that, sometimes play rook endgames, I see them push pawns and do all sorts of stuff, but their king and rook just are crap. Like they're just sitting in a corner. The king doesn't move to the center. The rook stays on a passive square. And almost always, one of the things they have to learn to do more is improve their king and improve their rook, really maximize them. So that's number 1 and 2, you could say. They're a little bit different. You have to treat them differently in that a rook can improve itself very fast, meaning sometimes you can let a rook be passive for a moment, but then can improve itself in a very rapid manner because they can move across the board very quickly. You have to be careful with this. If a rook's stuck defending a pawn and then all of a sudden can't move, it can be a huge problem. Having a passive rook in a lot of ways can be even more annoying than having a passive king, but a rook can improve itself more rapidly. A king takes time, meaning that oftentimes you actually improve your rook first because the rook can attack lots of things, so you maximize your rook first. And then the king takes longer to improve because it moves slower. So making sure then you're on the path to improving your king, even if it doesn't happen fast. You're always thinking about it. I saw a student game of mine the other week when I was teaching a camp where one player really improved their king and the other didn't, and it took a long time, but the king streaked across the board and they were able to win a pawn down rook endgame because they had an active king and their opponent didn't. So keeping an eye on the king is incredibly important. And then the third thing are pushing dangerous passed pawns. So dangerous pawns, that's a tricky gray area because everyone has a different idea of what that means. But generally speaking, a pawn that either is a huge queening threat or one that becomes close enough that the opponent has to have a passive rook. So if your rook, like for example, in this position, you'll see what I mean later, but if white's rook has to be passive to defend against the opponent's pawn, then it often is a very good sign, right? So a pawn that can force your opponent to have to deal with it by either making their king or their rook passive. The rook in particular, I would say, because a king defending against the passed pawn is often fine, and then it can take the pawn later and stuff like that, right? But if you can make your opponent's rook passive with that pawn, it's important. But prioritizing in this order, improving the rook, improving the king, improving, and then pushing your dangerous pawns will lead you in the right direction a lot. Not always. Everything's different. And it's good to have knowledge of rook endgames. Like, for example, if you end up with like king and f pawn against king and rook, you want to know exactly what endgames are won and which are not, because usually you should not allow that. But in certain cases, if you know it's a clear win, a technical win, you can do it. So having knowledge will help you, especially if you're not on time. So, but we're not talking about increasing your knowledge today. But following those guidelines will really help. So I want to show you these positions. There are plenty of decent ways to go about trying to win this. The one that I chose when my friend showed me this was Rook e4. The idea being just to cut off this king and push the pawn. This is a definitely fine way to do it. The general idea is like if white tries to improve their own rook. I like, first of all, the h pawn can't really move. If white plays rook h1, you can always play either king g5 or rook h4, right? They're not going to have the kind of time. So I thought that white would try to do this, right? Which is quite logical, to try to bring the rook back, to try to check your king and be active. But the problem is that after king g5, notice how this king can't actually participate. And the idea is king f4. You can then push the a pawn due to tactics on the king, that kind of thing. And this position is quite winning. Without going into all the details, a better option than what I came up with probably is rook h4. Better is a tricky word because they're both winning moves, but this move is very strong because you're also targeting this h pawn, which white doesn't want to give up. So they play a move like rook a1. So now you can't really try to go after the pawn. If you check on h3, for example, if the white king goes up, you have moves like a4, which might be tricky because this is a very common skewer, you'll see, this kind of thing, and then you can take the rook. But if the king goes back, you still actually can't save your a-pawn now. So after takes here, this is a good way to blow the game. And after check, just go back. And the problem is you can't save your pawn, and this kind of endgame, hopefully, which most of you know, is a draw because the king's in front. And the key now is you try to set up a fillet or a draw. So for example, after here, the traditional way to do this is you have a lot of different ways to start it, but the basic idea is, say you put your king here, so you force the rook, the rook moves, whatever. And now you can do all sorts of things, honestly. The main thing you don't allow, right, is you don't play check and then try to do it this way, because then I will do this and here, and this will become a problem. But you have all sorts of other ways you can kind of do this. One thing you can even do is bring the rook back, just for example. So you're just trying to check from behind, and if the king goes up now, you're a bit slow. But the general gist is that after the move f4, you want to play this to cut off the king. Again, basic kind of philidor knowledge. The plan being you provoke the pawn forward and go back. This video is not about that. I just wanted to show, in case you were unfamiliar with it. The idea of rook a8 is that you're going to check the king from behind indefinitely, and the king can no longer shelter itself on the f3 square. Again, this video is not about that, but the general gist is you want to know those kind of endgames like the back of your hand. You want to know them so well you can play them without thinking. That's the general rule. So, but the point is that it is a very drawn endgame, so you do not want to go for it. So a4 is the idea. And now what's cool is that this king is actually a little unfortunately placed. For example, if king e3, you still can't take the h-pawn, but you can play this move. And this is kind of clever. The idea being that if they take the pawn, you have the check. Very importantly, after king f4 takes, there's still a pawn, so it's not stalemate. This is a very common stalemate trap in these endgames. You do not want to fall for it. But the h-pawn actually makes it so that it's not a stalemate. So white has to play something like this, for instance, and now you have all sorts of things. Even bringing the rook behind the pawn is a nice way to do it. In general, rooks behind passed pawns are very nice because this white rook now can never move. It has to kind of stay here or go to a2 or whatever. And then black's able to slowly advance. It's not so easy in this particular position because the h-pawn makes it like slightly tricky. But the general gist is that you can play like, king up and pawn push and eventually try to, run white out of moves and things like that. I think the cleaner way to do it in this particular position is just advancing the king with the idea that now you put the rook behind the pawn and you're able to check the king. And this is actually kind of nice. So if the king moves back, like say here or whatever, you can actually just collect this pawn with the king. Notice how the rook can't move. And if the king goes up, you can actually play here and you run white out of moves, which is kind of funny. The idea being that white is kind of left without a move. They can't move this rook. If they push the pawn you can actually just run and you can actually collect it. You just have to be a little bit careful. Like in this position, for example, after here, you have to make sure that you throw in this check so they can't go near your pawn, and this is a very trivial win. So this is the nice, simple way to go about winning this position, generally speaking. In the game, f4 was played. Now, f4 might win in some cases. Here it happens not to win. With the benefit of table bases, we can see. But this is a move where, like, when I saw this, I'm like, maybe it's a win, maybe it's not. I don't know. I just know I would not play it. And again, a blitz game, you're just pushing, it's easy to just play a move like this. What I don't like about it is it doesn't improve our rook or our king. And I wouldn't say this f-pawn is particularly dangerous either. So what this means is that I think in the game white didn't do this, but white could have played h4 and distract our king with this pawn. And this is actually quite annoying because now, for example, we can't really improve our rook because notice our rook is tied to this pawn. That's one thing I don't like. The fact that we've played f4 means this rook, not only is it not great, it has to stay not great to defend our pawns. So here, for example, if we try king f5, white plays rook here, and then they can actually start running this pawn. And again, they're not going to get a queen, but they're going to force us to defend, and that will make it much easier for white to secure a draw. So king g6 would make sense. And here, white can actually play king e2. Normally, we could play rook a3 to cut off the king. Not in this case, because our pawn hangs. So what are we going to do? We play here. And now king f3 is a really nice move. The idea being, if they go here, we can cut off their king once again. But after here, even though we're up 2 pawns, we have a bad king and a bad rook. What this means is that we just can't win. So notice how we won a pawn, and we even get to keep it, but white can just sit and say, okay, what's your winning plan? And we have no winning plan. Our king has to stay cut off. Our pawns can't really advance. If we ever try to play a3, for example, there's rook a8 behind the pawn, takes, and because our king's so awful, we have no chance of winning here. So notice how improving the rook, maximizing the rook and the king, if that's your number one priority, you're not really going to play a move like f4. And in this position, it's a great example for my purposes because it's like clearly like blows the win. But you'll see this happen a lot. Even if it doesn't blow the win, even if you can still win, it makes your job harder. Again, if this f-pawn were a dangerous pawn, meaning a pawn that you're going to use to get a queen with, it would be a bit different. But it's not like that. That pawn is, is not really going anywhere, and it makes this rook stay passive. So this kind of mistake I see at lower levels all the time, but even sometimes masters and above make mistakes like this in these kind of rook endgames. So again, a really general rule, improve the rook, improve the king, maximize them. Then you start pushing pawns or making progress elsewhere, that kind of thing. But start with that first. And realizing the rook on a4 is misplaced takes some experience too. I wouldn't say that's super simple. So the next couple examples I wanted to show you were actually from the American Cup. So this is an event going on in St. Louis right now. A bunch of people, a bunch of really strong players playing. It's kind of a fun tournament. So I always follow events going on, and I use a lot of examples from them because I think it's actually a cool form of training is to try to predict what people are going to play and try to, especially really strong players, trying to think when they're thinking, what are they thinking about, and it's kind of a good training tool, I find, because sometimes I'll be thinking and I'll be like, oh, this move looks really obvious, but they're thinking, this really strong player who's better than me is thinking for 5-10 minutes. What are they thinking about? And often that'll encourage me to expand my own thought process. So it's a nice tool. This was the end of a game between Ray Robson and Wesley So. They played a really gripping, fun match. And this position, it was white to move. And it's clear that Ray is doing well. White Ray's up a pawn, but things are kind of messy. Everything's crazy. Like Ray broke through on the queen side with the king. Or the king side, sorry. I always forget which sides of the board when it's an endgame. But the question is, how do you improve and win this position? So again, if you'd like to pause, go for it. And try to figure out what you would do here as white. So I will admit that there's a tactical component here, which is important to see. People forget about rook endgame tactics, but it is kind of important. One thing I would say that's a bit unusual about this endgame is the rooks. This rook on a5 looks kind of silly, but because it's behind a passed pawn, you're noticing it's keeping this rook at bay. So you wouldn't say it's a bad piece, but it's also a bit weird, especially with this pawn on a4, because it means it can't move. If the pawn weren't here, the rook could move backwards. It would be a different story. But because the rook cannot move backwards, this rook is very awkward. That's one thing I would definitely notice and is important here. But it's quite clear that since the rook can't really be improved, you don't want to move away and give up the a-pawn, ideally. It is an option. You can play rook c5, give up the pawn, and play here. There are positions in which this is maybe a reasonable choice. But let's pretend that we want to keep our rook for the moment, because it is nice to have this rook be really passive on is7. We want to improve the king. So this is something that's really hard to do. Ray was able to do it, unsurprisingly, but for a lot of players, it's very hard. The white king worked so hard to get to h6, to break up black structure here, to get active. One of the hard things to realize when you're playing is when a piece no longer serves its function on a particular side of the board. And the fact is, the king's done its job. It broke up black's king side. It's done its job. It actually should come back now. One big mistake that you could make here would be a move like this. Now, it actually could be wrong for different reasons, but the main problem with it is tactical, and that is keeping an eye on your rook. Now, if black plays this move, you actually have a problem, because they're not just threatening king b6, trapping the rook. They're threatening it, and it's a check. Meaning, if you try to play rook c5, for instance, king b6 check, whoopsie. So that means that king takes h7 and king g7 are actually not great moves because of this king c7 to b6 maneuver. So very, very important to see this. So the correct course of action, which is what Ray chose, is actually this move. Very, very nice move. So the king no longer serves a purpose, so you want to get the king back to where it can go. And Ray's plan here is actually this. He is threatening the pawn, so that's a big part of it, but he also wants to go back. So if the black king goes back now, the king b6 is a threat, but it's not check, which means white has time to play this move. And this is easily one position. The idea is that if the king goes to b6 now, you can simply play rook e5, and you're ready to push the pawn. And if black tries to go back this way, you play king f6. And again, you're ready to push this pawn to bring the rook behind it. You have all sorts of ways to win now. So king g5 both stops black's threat and also has a nice plan with the king. And you'll see this plan actually come to fruition. So Wesley plays here to guard the f-pawn, most probably, and prevent moves like king f6, which would be deadly. So king f4. Again, Ray's trying to complete his plan. Wesley plays here. Probably because if h5, he didn't want the king just moving back and just taking the pawn and then coming back this way, right? Like, the problem is when you can't make threats, your opponent can take their time. And that's often a bad thing. So Wesley does this to keep the king out. King e3, king d7, king c5, king d4 rather. So Wesley plays h5, wants to get some form of counterplay. The king, if it moves back now, then king c7 to b6 is a bit faster. So Ray simply goes here. So you have to be careful with a move like this, because after king c7, notice how both of these pieces are trapped. So you need to do this with a plan in mind. But there is a plan here. So if Wesley tries to do what he did in the game with this, to try to create a dangerous passed pawn, this is where you have to be very careful, because your rook and king are a bit immobile. But you have this move, and what's very important is that if black ever chooses to play h3, so for example h3 here, and h2, it looks like you can't stop the pawn, but white has this, and then behind the pawn, and you're able to take it. So that's the general idea. So for that reason, Wesley plays here, but now the e-pawn can move. So if you go for something like this, this should be said, even with low on time, I'm sure Ray calculated this very carefully. And you could see him playing very carefully when you're watching, because this requires very, very precise calculation. But the idea is that Wesley tries to make a passed pawn, of course, but you have e7, and because you're threatening the queen, you're a bit too fast. If you try king d7, you have this, and again, the rook can get behind the pawn, making the h-pawn not so dangerous. But notice how both sides are actually doing my passed pawn roll. Both the king and the rook are kind of immobile and cannot improve. So it's all about how dangerous you can make your passed pawns. The pawn on e7 is a dangerous pawn that must be dealt with. So rook a8. Now you have to be careful about pushing pawns. Sometimes you push them, they just go into your opponent's gullet, right? Like it's just like, okay, I'll just take them now. But here, there are dangerous pawns, and one of the pawns, after a7, the idea is you're threatening e8. So this is actually how the game ended, h3, e8, queen, and then queen. And the whole problem is you have to take it, and the rook will easily go behind the pawn. But the point here was that after king d7, rook king b6, and the rook goes to h5, and the same thing here. King d7 and king b7, it's the same problem. But notice how you have both pawns. Black could stop one of them, but not both of them. So you use one pawn as a distraction, but in order for a pawn to be a distraction, it has to be dangerous. So once again, notice it. Maximizing the king and rook is what happened. Once they were done, passed pawns. Again, it's oversimplifying what happened in this endgame. Every endgame does have precise calculation. There's no getting around that. However, going by these kind of techniques will usually help guide you in a good direction. So notice how Ray improved his king first, and then once that was maximized, was able to push pawns. Now, if he didn't have those pawns or it didn't work, probably he would have chosen a different plan. For example, rook c5, giving up the a pawn to play a5 to improve his rook might have been a better plan if he didn't have this one that he had worked out. So I have one more for you, and that is this position. This was from a same event, a different match. This game was Dominguez against Sam Shankland. Sam Shankland was black. And the question is how to try to go about winning this position. So black's up a pawn. Everything's on the same side of the board, but unlike in positions where it's like 4 versus 3, where everything is kind of together, those positions are usually drawn with best play. Although it's, far from clear, it's definitely not 100%. Here, Sam has the benefit of having a passed e-pawn, which is very, very useful. And, very active pieces and stuff like this. So the question is, how do you go about winning this? If you'd like to pause your video, go ahead and try to figure out a move and a plan. The basic idea here is that the rook on h4 is about as good as it can get. Like, it's not really getting better. So it's, I don't know. You can't really improve it that much. The piece you can improve, though, if you look at the king, is definitely has an improvement here. And that's what he plays. You could play the move a4. I don't hate it. It's funny, a computer, of course, is irrelevant. Like, it thinks everything's kind of winning. So you often don't listen to the computer, actually, that much in positions like this, because it'll tell you 2 ways to win are equivalent, because it can just calculate them out to the end. But a human being should definitely play another one. This move I don't mind. I don't mind a4 here. The idea is if b4, this you're relatively happy with. You go here, this a pawn's weak, and you're going to try to queen your pawn. I don't love allowing a trade, though. In general, trades are not your friend in these kind of endgames. The main trick is that if rook takes a4, white has the tempo move rook here to make sure black can't take this pawn. Obviously, they can, but this is way too many pawn trades. So black should play here. They're still winning. But after here, what I don't like is that now their pawns have been traded. B pawn's still a little weak. Like, this is not moving the game more in the direction I want. So while a4 is still a winning move, I don't really love it. So Sam instead played the move king d4, which I really like. So it does 2 things. Obviously, it helps support this pawn, but the king also potentially can go into this square, which is actually what happened, which is a very important feature of the position. So Linear took this pawn. Probably he didn't like the alternatives. But the general idea is that if the king goes to b2, for instance, to try to cut off this king, notice how going to d2 is not so great because I can check you and then push this pawn, and the king is forced backwards anyway. Whereas after king b2, e4, and the main idea now is this e-pawn is just way too strong. So it's ready to play e2 and get a queen. If rook takes b5, you have to be careful now. A lot of people would do this too hastily, and then you end up in this position where you get a queen, but white has a rook and several pawns, and I think here you can put the rook on d3, and good luck cracking that fortress. good way to not win a game. Let's put it that way. The funny thing is, white's extra pawns are sometimes not super relevant. Here they are, because if you just have a C pawn, black has ideas of, you know, sacking the queen and stuff, which you don't have facing multiple pawns. But that's another story. It's very clear it's bad technique to do this. But you can just play rook h1. And the idea is now you cannot stop e2, e1. So for example, if here you go back, e2, and you're going to get a queen, upper rook, these pawns are not long for this world, especially considering you have an extra d pawn, makes it super easy. So that's what Linear did not like, so he took the a5 pawn. But you'll notice that both the white king and the right rook are not good. So even though white is temporarily even in material now, black maximizes the king and the rook. So here there's a mate threat of rook h1, so white does not have time to fix the rook. But this is, again, a great example of good technique. Even though you're giving up a pawn, I actually prefer this technique to a4, which doesn't give up a pawn, because we're maximizing our pieces and creating an extremely dangerous passed pawn. So very understandably, Linear goes towards that pawn. You can go to b1. This is very ugly, of course. And the main problem here is that this e-pawn just becomes too fast too quickly. Becomes way too dangerous, way too fast. Like, it's just going to make a queen. There is one last trick, which is rook takes here. Please do not do this to yourself. This is the ultimate embarrassment. But you check first and then push the pawn. And you're just going to get a queen. And this is not one of those cases where you do this and then say, oh, but the three pawns are good. The three pawns are not that good. This pawn's already ripe for the picking. They are already paralyzed. This is not a very close endgame to a draw. So for that reason, Linear chose this move. Now we check. And this is another excellent moment. I think a lot of people will automatically just be, yum. But now after takes, there's a problem because the pawns are kind of skewered a bit. And rook c5 check is in the air. This has made things way too messy. So Sam gives this check first, which is actually a much more precise way to do it. And you'll notice a lot of people, this is the difference between like a solid rook endgame player and a really great rook endgame player, is being able to find these kind of little sneaky checks, right? Now, the check itself doesn't impact the position that much, because what happens is with rook endgames, if you're a beginner player, new to them, you want to check all the time, and then you realize it's usually bad if you're improving your opponent's pieces. So then there are people who don't use the checks, but you'll notice that when you get really experienced and learn these rook endgames, these kind of checks are often the difference between really solid technique and making it messier. And sometimes they're absolutely necessary. So the general idea is that Linear played back here. If you go up, I have a check here. And when I take now, the problem is that my pawn is like really well escorted. So if you play rook takes b5, I have rook e2 check, d3, and the idea is I can play e4. Notice how this would not be remotely possible without having that check thrown in. Very importantly. But yeah, this is a very common kind of solid structure. You play e4 check and the rook and pawns defend each other, and this is just going to make a queen. White's pawns are, as I mentioned, the dangerous pawn thing. These are not dangerous pawns yet. Just because they're connected passers does not make them dangerous. It will take them many moves to become dangerous. So for that reason, the king goes back to d1. And now the whole point is that Sam has this move rook d2 check. So the whole point is that the king has to go to e1, otherwise you take c2 with check, which is a huge disaster. So here, rook takes c2, rook takes b5. And now this kind of move also is very hard to find because you want to push, right? You want to go like, I'm going to queen. But it's not so easy to just queen here, especially with checks and the rook blocking the pawn. You can just go back. And the cool thing now is that notice how white's king is cut off on the first. That's usually a terrible place. Black's king is monstrous. And the pawns are ready to push. And these pawns are going to be much faster than white's pawns because they're already farther up. And notice also how, because the better king and the better rook, it's going to make it even easier. So better pawns, better king, better rook usually equals a pretty easy win. And that's what happened. a4, e4, a5, e3. So a6 was played. There's not really much else to do if you don't push the pawn. If you try to improve your rook, for instance, I go here and I'm already threatening mates. So Linear's idea is to play a6 so the rook stays glued to this d pawn. So there are many ways to win. I think this is very clean. Rook a2 behind the pawn. So notice how if white defends, king d3, threatening rook a1 is game over. So b4. And Sam does this in a very pragmatic way, which is he just takes this pawn. He doesn't try to do anything fancy. Yeah, and this is basically over. The basic gist is that once you have the connected pawns and the great king, it's just not much you can do. And it's really hard for white to even move here. Like, again, if rook b8, something like this, you have king d3. If you try king e2, I can play king e4, threatening rook a2 check. That's going to be kind of game over. If rook a5, rook h6. And again, once you force the king to the back and have the pawns going, it's going to be over very quickly. And if rook a5 here, you can actually take the thing and catch the pawn on d4, catch this. It's game over. So a really nice display of technique by both Ray and Sam in these games. And again, I find you'll notice that like watching the technique of really strong players is a great way to improve your own. And I'm always trying to pick up new tricks and tips. But the main thing, if you can take anything away from these videos, it's whether you're short on time or not, have your priorities straight in these rook endgames, especially if you're on the better side, but even on the worst side, it's often similar, which is that maximize your rook and your king. Note that the rook is a faster improving piece and the king takes time. You have to let yourself have time to improve your king. And then pushing your dangerous passed pawns that are going to threaten to queen and force your opponent to deal with them, either by making a rook or a king passive, usually. There's a lot more to rook endgames than that, but those techniques will really keep your play a lot more clean, and probably you'll have more success. Anyway, thanks for all the support, all the comments on the videos. I really appreciate it. A lot of good feedback. Definitely like and subscribe if you haven't. It helps me grow the channel, helps me, encourages me to do more of these videos. And definitely, if you like my teaching style, check out my Chessable course. There's a link in the description. I worked very hard on it. It's aimed for beginners, but it's, it definitely, intermediate players have told me there are some tricky positions, so you might find it interesting. So check that out, and I will see you next time.